The moment I knew everything had changed was not when they stole my project. It was not when they handed my 18 months of work to a man who could not code his way out of a basic loop. It was not even when Gerald Whitfield looked me in the eyes and told me I should be grateful for the opportunity to support his son's leadership. No. The moment I knew was 3 seconds later when Brandon Whitfield smirked at me from across the conference table. That smirk contained everything I needed to understand about my future at Whitfield Technologies. It told me that my talent meant nothing, my sacrifice meant nothing, my countless nights debugging code until my eyes burned, my weekends spent perfecting algorithms while my friends lived their lives, my unwavering loyalty to a company I genuinely believed in. All of it meant absolutely nothing. That smirk told me I was disposable, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. Not broke, shifted. Because breaking implies damage, implies weakness. What happened to me in that conference room was more like a recalibration. Every assumption I had made about hard work, about merit, about fairness, all of it recalibrated into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I am going to tell you how I took everything from the people who stole everything from me. Not through anger, not through impulse, through patience, through precision, through the systematic dismantling of a company that thought it could throw me away like I was nothing. This is the story of how loyalty betrayed becomes loyalty weaponized. I need you to understand who I was before all of this happened. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where ambition was treated with suspicion. My father worked at a manufacturing plant until it closed when I was 14. My mother cleaned houses for families who had more than we could ever dream of. We were not poor in the dramatic, cinematic sense. We were poor in the grinding, daily sense, the sense where you learn early that wanting things is a luxury you cannot afford. But I wanted things anyway. I wanted to understand how computers worked. I wanted to build things that mattered. I wanted to prove that where you start does not determine where you end. I taught myself to code using library computers and free online resources. I stayed after school in the computer lab until the janitors kicked me out. I applied for every scholarship I could find and earned enough to attend a state university where I majored in computer science and graduated at the top of my class. My first job was at a small startup that failed within 2 years. My second job was at a mid-sized tech company where I learned that corporate politics mattered more than competence. My third job was at Whitfield Technologies, and I genuinely believed it would be the place where I finally belonged. Whitfield Technologies was a software development company specializing in enterprise solutions. They had been in business for over 20 years, built a solid reputation, and had clients ranging from regional banks to national retail chains. When I joined as a senior developer, I was immediately impressed by the technical talent on the team and the scope of the projects we were tackling. I worked harder than anyone else. I volunteered for the difficult assignments. I stayed late to help junior developers who were struggling. I built relationships with clients who specifically requested me for their projects. Within 2 years, I had been promoted to project lead, and within 3 years, I was being discussed as a potential candidate for the director of development position. That was when Gerald Whitfield called me into his office and told me about Project Horizon. Gerald was an imposing man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of practiced confidence that comes from never having been seriously challenged. He had inherited Whitfield Technologies from his father, who had founded the company in the early days of enterprise software. Gerald had expanded the business significantly, but I had always sensed that his success came more from timing and connections than from any particular vision or brilliance. Still, I respected him. He had given me opportunities. He had praised my work publicly. He had made me feel like I had a future at this company. That afternoon, Gerald told me that Whitfield Technologies was at a crossroads. The enterprise software market was changing rapidly. Cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and automation were transforming what clients expected from their technology partners. The company needed to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. Project Horizon was his answer. He wanted to develop a revolutionary new platform that would integrate AI-driven analytics with traditional enterprise resource planning. It would be a complete reimagining of how businesses manage their operations, smarter, faster, more intuitive than anything currently on the market, and he wanted me to lead the development team. I remember feeling overwhelmed by the opportunity. This was exactly the kind of project I had dreamed about since I first learned to code, a chance to build something genuinely innovative, something that could change an entire industry. Gerald told me that he was giving me complete creative control, unlimited resources, and a team of the best developers in the company. I thanked him profusely. I promised him that I would not let him down. I walked out of his office feeling like everything I had worked for was finally coming together. I was so naive. The first 6 months of Project Horizon were the most fulfilling of my career. I assembled a team of 8 developers, including Marcus Chen, who became my closest collaborator and eventually my most trusted ally. We worked in a dedicated space on the 4th floor of the building, separated from the regular operations, focused entirely on bringing Gerald's vision to life. Except it was not really Gerald's vision. The initial concept he had described was vague and conventional. The actual innovation, the breakthrough architecture, the novel algorithms, the integration framework that made everything work together seamlessly, all of that came from me and my team. We took a generic idea and transformed it into something genuinely revolutionary. I documented everything, every design decision, every technical specification, every problem we solved and how we solved it. I created comprehensive records because that was how I worked, methodically, thoroughly, leaving nothing to chance. Those documents would later become the most valuable weapons in my arsenal, but at the time, I was simply being professional. By month 12, we had a working prototype. It was rough around the edges, but the core functionality was there, and it was impressive. Gerald was ecstatic when I demonstrated it to him. He talked about how Project Horizon was going to position Whitfield Technologies as an industry leader. He talked about the clients who would be clamoring to adopt this new platform. He talked about my future with the company in terms that made me believe I was being groomed for executive leadership. He never mentioned his son. Brandon Whitfield had been a peripheral figure in my awareness of the company. I knew Gerald had a son who occasionally appeared at company events, usually looking bored and checking his phone. I knew Brandon had tried and failed to launch his own startup a few years earlier, something involving an app that I never fully understood. I knew he had a reputation for arrogance and a work ethic that could generously be described as inconsistent. What I did not know was that Gerald had been grooming Brandon to eventually take over the company. What I did not know was that Gerald saw Project Horizon as the perfect vehicle for establishing Brandon's credibility in the industry. What I did not know was that my 18 months of tireless work were always intended to be a gift to a man who had never earned anything in his life. I found out on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Gerald called an all-hands meeting for the development division. This was unusual. Typically, company-wide announcements came from HR or were distributed via email. An in-person meeting suggested something significant. The conference room was packed. My entire team was there, along with developers from other projects, managers, and several executives I only recognized from the company directory. Gerald stood at the front of the room with a practiced smile that I now recognize as the expression of someone who knows they are about to do something unconscionable. He began by praising the incredible work that had been done on Project Horizon. He talked about the innovation, the dedication, the countless hours of effort. He talked about how this project represented the future of Whitfield Technologies. He talked about how proud he was of everyone involved. Then he introduced the new head of Project Horizon. Brandon Whitfield walked to the front of the room like he was accepting an award he had always known he deserved. He was wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He smiled at the assembled employees with the casual confidence of someone who has never faced a consequence in his entire life. Gerald explained that Brandon would be taking over leadership of Project Horizon effective immediately. He described Brandon's previous experience, spinning his failed startup as a valuable learning opportunity, and expressed complete confidence in Brandon's ability to guide the project to successful completion. I sat frozen in my chair. Gerald then announced that I would be transitioning to a support role, assisting Brandon with the technical aspects of the project. He framed this as an opportunity for me to focus on what I did best, the technical work, while Brandon handled the leadership and strategic elements. He never made eye contact with me during the entire announcement. The meeting ended. People began filing out, most of them avoiding looking at me, clearly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Marcus caught my eye from across the room, and his expression told me everything I needed to know about how this looked from the outside. Brandon approached me before I could leave. He extended his hand like we were meeting for the first time, like he had not just stolen everything I had spent 18 months building. He told me he was looking forward to working together. He said he had heard great things about my technical abilities. He said he was confident that together we would make Project Horizon a massive success. Then he smirked. It was subtle. Just a slight curl at the corner of his mouth, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Anyone else might have missed it, but I was watching him carefully, studying him the way I studied code, looking for bugs, for vulnerabilities, for the truth hidden beneath the surface. That smirk told me this was not a business decision. This was not about what was best for the project or the company. This was about power. This was about a father handing his son something impressive to put on his resume. This was about someone who had everything deciding to take the one thing I had earned. I shook his hand. I smiled. I told him I looked forward to working together, and in that moment, I began planning his destruction. The first phase was observation. I could not make any moves while I was emotional. I knew that anger leads to mistakes, and mistakes would only give Gerald and Brandon ammunition to dismiss me entirely. So I controlled myself. I showed up to work every day. I answered Brandon's questions, though there were not many, since he seemed to have little interest in actually understanding the technical details of the project he now led. I documented everything. Within the first 2 weeks, I had a comprehensive picture of exactly how incompetent Brandon truly was. He did not understand the architecture of the system we had built. He could not explain the core algorithms to clients or stakeholders. He made decisions based on what sounded impressive rather than what was technically feasible. He took credit for solutions that other team members developed and blamed those same team members when his decisions caused problems. Most damningly, he began making changes to the project timeline and specifications without consulting the technical team. He promised features to potential clients that would take months to develop, then demanded that my team deliver them in weeks. When we explained that this was impossible, he accused us of lacking commitment. 3 months into Brandon's leadership, Project Horizon was behind schedule, over budget, and producing a product that was significantly less impressive than the prototype I had demonstrated to Gerald. The revolutionary vision was being diluted into something generic and mediocre. I documented all of this as well. Marcus Chen became my closest confidant during this period. He had watched everything unfold with a mixture of disgust and helpless frustration. Like me, he had invested years in Whitfield Technologies. Like me, he had believed that hard work and talent would be rewarded. Like me, he was coming to understand that we had been naive. We began meeting outside of work, coffee shops, parks, anywhere we could speak freely. Marcus had a network of contacts throughout the company, people who trusted him because he had helped them over the years. Through these contacts, I began to learn things about the Whitfield family that I had never known. Brandon's failed startup had not simply run out of money. It had collapsed because Brandon had alienated every partner and investor through a combination of arrogance and negligence. He had made promises he could not keep, taken credit for work he did not do, and blamed everyone except himself when things fell apart. Gerald had covered up the extent of the failure to protect the family name. He had paid off people who might have spoken publicly about Brandon's incompetence. He had used his connections to ensure that Brandon's reputation remained intact despite his track record of destruction. Project Horizon was supposed to be Brandon's redemption story. Gerald was using my work, my innovation, my team's dedication to rehabilitate his son's image. I was not just being exploited, I was being used as a tool to perpetuate a lie. This realization changed something in me. Until that point, I had been focused on my own grievance, the personal injustice of having my work stolen. But now I understood that this was about something larger. This was about a system that rewarded mediocrity and punished merit. This was about wealthy, connected people using others as stepping stones. If I was going to seek revenge, I was going to make it count. The second phase was intelligence gathering. I needed to understand everything about Whitfield Technologies. Not just Project Horizon, but the entire operation, the client relationships, the financial structure, the vulnerabilities. If I was going to hurt them, I needed to know exactly where they were weakest. I began paying attention to conversations I would have previously ignored. I cultivated relationships with people in departments I had never visited. I asked questions that seemed casual but were carefully designed to extract specific information. What I learned was illuminating. Whitfield Technologies was more vulnerable than anyone realized. The company had been coasting on its reputation for years, failing to innovate while competitors steadily caught up. Gerald had made several poor investment decisions that had strained the company's finances. The only thing keeping major clients loyal was the relationships that senior staff, people like me, had built over years of dedicated service. I also learned about the competition. Nexus Systems was a newer company, founded about 8 years earlier by a woman named Victoria Okafor. Victoria had a reputation in the industry as a brilliant technologist and a demanding but fair leader. Nexus had been growing aggressively, winning contracts that would previously have gone to established players like Whitfield Technologies. I had met Victoria once, briefly, at an industry conference about 2 years earlier. We had discussed emerging trends in enterprise software, and I had been impressed by her vision and her willingness to challenge conventional thinking. I had not thought much about that conversation since. Now I began to think about it constantly. Victoria Okafor represented everything Gerald Whitfield did not. She had built her company from nothing. She promoted based on talent rather than connections. She valued innovation and rewarded the people who produced it. If I was going to leave Whitfield Technologies, and I knew by now that I had to leave, Nexus Systems was where I wanted to go. But I did not just want to leave. I wanted to take everything with me. The third phase was preparation. I spent 3 months carefully organizing everything I knew about Whitfield Technologies. I reviewed every document I had created during my tenure, ensuring that I understood exactly what I owned versus what belonged to the company. I consulted discreetly with an employment attorney to understand my rights and obligations. The legal situation was complicated, but not impossible. I had signed standard employment agreements, but many of the innovations at the core of Project Horizon had been developed using methodologies I had created before joining the company. I had brought intellectual property with me, and I had documentation to prove it. More importantly, I was not planning to steal anything. I was not going to take proprietary code or confidential client data. What I was going to take was far more valuable. I was going to take knowledge, understanding of the market, insight into Whitfield's weaknesses, and the relationships I had built with clients over years of exceptional service. None of that was protected by any contract I had signed. None of it was illegal to share. It was simply information, the kind of information that, in the right hands, could reshape an entire industry. I reached out to Victoria Okafor in February. The message I sent was carefully crafted. I introduced myself, referenced our previous meeting, and suggested that we might have mutually beneficial interests to discuss. I mentioned that I was exploring new opportunities and that I had developed some perspectives on the enterprise software market that she might find valuable. Victoria responded within 2 days. She suggested we meet in person. Our first meeting was at a coffee shop in a city 3 hours from where I lived. I did not want anyone from Whitfield Technologies to see us together. I was not doing anything wrong, but I knew how things could be perceived, and I wanted to control the narrative. Victoria was exactly as I remembered, sharp, direct, and intensely curious. She asked me about my work at Whitfield Technologies, about Project Horizon, about my reasons for wanting to leave. I told her about the project being handed to Gerald's son. I told her about Brandon's incompetence. I told her about the culture of nepotism and the devaluation of talent. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted to build something that mattered. I wanted to work for a company that valued merit. I wanted to see the people who had stolen my work face the consequences of their choices. She asked if I was seeking revenge. I considered the question carefully before answering. Yes, I said. I was seeking revenge, but not the kind that involved sabotage or destruction. I wanted to win. I wanted to build something better than what I had left behind, and I wanted to do it in a way that exposed the fundamental weakness of what Whitfield Technologies had become. Victoria smiled at that. She said she understood exactly what I meant. We met 3 more times over the following weeks. Each meeting was longer and more detailed than the last. I shared my analysis of the enterprise software market, my assessment of Whitfield's vulnerabilities, my ideas for how Nexus could capitalize on opportunities that Whitfield was too complacent or too incompetent to pursue. I also shared something else: the names of every major Whitfield client who had expressed frustration with the company's direction over the past year. This was not confidential information in a legal sense. I was not revealing trade secrets or protected data. I was simply sharing observations about market conditions, which clients were happy, which were dissatisfied, which might be open to exploring alternatives. It was devastating intelligence, delivered with precision. Victoria offered me a position as Director of Product Development at Nexus Systems. The salary was significantly higher than what I was making at Whitfield. The role was exactly what I had dreamed of: leadership of a team focused on genuine innovation. I accepted. The fourth phase was departure. I resigned from Whitfield Technologies on a Friday morning in April. I submitted my letter of resignation directly to HR, with a copy to my immediate supervisor. I did not inform Gerald or Brandon in advance. My resignation letter was professional and brief. I thanked the company for the opportunities I had been given. I expressed confidence in the team I was leaving behind. I said nothing about the true reasons for my departure. Gerald summoned me to his office 2 hours after my resignation was received. He was furious. Not in the dramatic, shouting sense. Gerald was too controlled for that. But his jaw was tight. His eyes were cold, and his voice had an edge that I had never heard before. He told me that I was making a mistake. He told me that I was throwing away years of investment in my career. He told me that I would never find another opportunity like Whitfield Technologies. Then he asked where I was going. I told him I was joining Nexus Systems. The expression on his face in that moment is something I will never forget. It was not just anger, it was fear. He understood immediately what my departure to a direct competitor meant. He understood that I was taking more than just my skills. I was taking knowledge, relationships, and insights that could not be replaced. He tried to convince me to stay. He offered a promotion. He offered a salary increase. He even suggested that perhaps there had been a misunderstanding regarding Project Horizon, that perhaps my role could be reconsidered. I declined everything. Before I left his office, I said one thing that I had been planning for months. I told him that I hoped Brandon would do well with Project Horizon. I told him that I had left comprehensive documentation that should help the team continue without me. I told him that I was confident the project was in good hands. I delivered all of this with complete sincerity. And Gerald knew, he had to know, that I was lying. Project Horizon was not in good hands. Without me and the team members who understood the actual technology, Brandon would be lost. The documentation I had left was thorough, but documentation cannot replace expertise. The project was going to fail, and there was nothing Gerald could do to prevent it. I walked out of Whitfield Technologies for the last time that afternoon. Marcus Chen walked out with me. He had accepted a position at Nexus as well. So had 2 other members of my original Project Horizon team. We took nothing that belonged to the company. We took only what belonged to us: our skills, our knowledge, our relationships, and our determination to build something better. The 5th phase was construction. My first 6 months at Nexus Systems were intense but exhilarating. Victoria gave me the resources and the autonomy to build a team and develop a product vision that incorporated everything I had learned, both at Whitfield and from my own years of experience. We began developing a new platform that addressed exactly the market needs I had identified during my analysis. It was not a copy of Project Horizon. It was better. Freed from the constraints of Brandon's interference and Gerald's limited vision, I was able to create something that truly realized the potential I had always seen. I also began reaching out to clients. Again, I want to be clear about what I did and did not do. I did not steal client lists or contact information. I did not violate any confidentiality agreements or legal obligations. What I did was leverage relationships I had built over years of personal service. Margaret Thornton was one of the first calls I made. She was the CEO of a regional banking chain and one of Whitfield's largest clients. I had worked with her for over 4 years, and she had specifically requested me for every major project her company undertook. I did not ask Margaret to leave Whitfield. I simply called to inform her that I had moved to a new company and wanted to let her know personally. I told her about Nexus Systems, about our vision, about the kind of innovative solutions we were developing. Margaret asked me pointed questions about why I had left. I answered honestly, more honestly than I had been with Gerald. I told her about Project Horizon being handed to someone unqualified. I told her about the culture that prioritized connections over competence. I told her about my concerns regarding Whitfield's ability to continue delivering the level of service she had come to expect. 2 weeks later, Margaret's company initiated a review of their Whitfield contract. Similar conversations happened with other clients over the following months. I was careful, always staying within ethical and legal boundaries. I never promised anything I could not deliver. I never disparaged Whitfield beyond stating factual concerns. I simply made myself available and let the quality of my work speak for itself. The results were devastating for Whitfield Technologies. Within a year of my departure, Nexus Systems had acquired contracts from 7 former Whitfield clients, representing over $40 million in annual revenue. Our new platform was generating significant industry buzz, with trade publications highlighting us as an emerging leader in enterprise software innovation. Meanwhile, Project Horizon had collapsed. I heard the details from former colleagues who had stayed at Whitfield. Without the technical expertise of the original team, Brandon had been unable to maintain the development schedule. Features that were promised to clients were delayed repeatedly. The quality of the product deteriorated as less experienced developers struggled to understand systems they had not built. Several key clients who had been promised early access to Project Horizon began demanding refunds and threatening lawsuits. The company's reputation, already strained, was being systematically destroyed by Brandon's incompetence and Gerald's stubborn refusal to acknowledge the magnitude of the problem. Brandon responded to the pressure exactly as I had predicted, by blaming everyone except himself. He fired several developers who had been trying their best to salvage the project. He accused the remaining team of sabotage and disloyalty. He became increasingly paranoid and hostile, creating an atmosphere that drove even more talented people to leave. Gerald, for his part, continued to protect his son publicly while reportedly raging at him privately. The dynamic between them became a source of constant gossip in the industry. The father who had sacrificed his company's future to protect his son's ego. I watched all of this happen with a satisfaction that I am not proud of, but cannot deny. Every piece of bad news about Whitfield Technologies felt like vindication. Every client they lost felt like justice. Every sign of Brandon's failure felt like proof that I had been right all along. But I was not satisfied yet. I wanted more. The 6th phase was escalation. About 18 months after I joined Nexus, Victoria called me into her office with an unusual request. She had been approached by investors who were interested in positioning Nexus for aggressive growth. They believed the company could become a dominant player in the enterprise software market if we moved quickly to consolidate market share. Part of their proposed strategy involved acquiring smaller competitors. Victoria asked me to lead the analysis of potential acquisition targets. I spent 2 weeks reviewing the landscape, evaluating companies based on their technology, market position, client base, and financial health. I was thorough and objective, considering each possibility on its merits. Then I added one more company to the list, Whitfield Technologies. On paper, acquiring Whitfield made sense. Despite their recent troubles, they still had valuable client relationships and a recognizable brand. Their technical infrastructure, though neglected, had potential, and their current financial weakness meant they could potentially be acquired at a significant discount. But I was not recommending Whitfield because it made business sense. I was recommending it because I wanted to own the company that had discarded me. I wanted to walk into Gerald's office not as an employee asking for recognition, but as someone who now controlled his fate. Victoria reviewed my analysis carefully. She asked me probing questions about the Whitfield recommendation, clearly aware of my personal history with the company. She wanted to know if my judgment was being clouded by emotion. I told her the truth. Yes, I had personal reasons for wanting this acquisition, but those personal reasons did not change the business case. Whitfield Technologies represented a genuine opportunity, and the fact that acquiring them would also deliver justice for what had been done to me was a bonus, not a primary motivation. Victoria considered this for a long moment. Then she approved the acquisition analysis. The next 3 months were consumed by due diligence. Nexus assembled a team to thoroughly evaluate Whitfield's finances, operations, and legal obligations. What we discovered was worse than I had expected. Whitfield Technologies was bleeding money. The failure of Project Horizon had cost the company several major clients and had resulted in significant legal settlements. Gerald had been taking on debt to cover operating expenses, creating a financial structure that was increasingly unsustainable. The company was not yet in crisis, but it was heading toward one with alarming speed. There was also something I had not anticipated. Gerald was looking to sell. The stress of the past 2 years had taken a toll. His health had declined. His relationship with Brandon had become openly hostile, with multiple employees reporting screaming matches between father and son. Gerald had apparently concluded that the best path forward was to find a buyer who could absorb Whitfield and its problems. Nexus was not the only interested party. There were 2 other potential acquirers who had approached Whitfield, but we had advantages that they did not: intimate knowledge of the company's true condition, relationships with key clients and employees, and a clear vision for integration. I led the negotiation team. The meetings with Gerald were professional and businesslike. He seemed to have aged significantly since I had last seen him. The silver hair was now white, the confident posture now slightly stooped. He was still trying to project authority, but there was a weariness underneath that he could not entirely hide. He knew, of course, that I had played a central role in his company's decline. He knew that the clients we had acquired, the talent we had recruited, the market position we had established, all of it had come at his expense. He knew that I was not simply participating in this acquisition, but orchestrating it. And yet he had no choice but to negotiate with me. The alternatives were worse: a fire sale to buyers who would strip the company for parts, or a slow descent into bankruptcy that would destroy his legacy entirely. We negotiated for 6 weeks. I was scrupulously fair in my terms. This was not about extracting maximum pain, but about achieving a result that would be sustainable. The final agreement involved Nexus acquiring Whitfield Technologies at a price that was reasonable given the company's condition, with provisions for retaining key employees and maintaining existing client relationships. There was one term that I insisted upon, and I did not compromise. Brandon Whitfield would not be offered a position at the combined company. His departure would be part of the acquisition agreement, non-negotiable. Gerald fought this provision harder than anything else. He made arguments about family, about fairness, about giving Brandon another chance to prove himself. He suggested that perhaps Brandon could take a minor role, something that would preserve his dignity while removing him from any real responsibility. I refused. I told Gerald that Brandon's incompetence had cost the company millions of dollars and had damaged relationships that would take years to repair. I told him that keeping Brandon in any capacity would signal to the employees of both companies that Nexus tolerated the same nepotism that had destroyed Whitfield. I told him that this was not negotiable. Eventually, Gerald accepted. The acquisition closed on a Thursday in November, almost exactly 3 years after the conference room meeting where my project had been stolen. I walked into the Whitfield Technologies building that afternoon as the new director of integration, responsible for managing the merger of the 2 companies. I walked past the conference room where Gerald had announced Brandon's takeover of Project Horizon. I walked past the 4th-floor workspace where my team had built something revolutionary. I walked past all the places that held memories of hope and betrayal. And then I walked into Gerald's office, my office now, and I sat down in his chair. The view from that chair was different than I had expected. The city spread out below me, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in the buildings that filled it. I thought about everything that had happened, all the phases of my revenge, all the careful planning and patient execution. I thought about whether it had been worth it. The 7th phase was reflection. The integration process took nearly a year. It was complex and challenging, requiring careful management of competing cultures, redundant systems, and anxious employees. I worked harder during that year than I had worked at any point in my career, but it was also deeply satisfying. I was building something real, something that combined the best elements of both companies while discarding the dysfunction that had plagued Whitfield. The clients we retained were pleased with the direction of the combined company. The employees who stayed were energized by the new possibilities. Marcus became my right hand throughout this process, as he had been for years. He understood what I was trying to achieve and shared my vision for what the combined company could become. Together, we rebuilt Project Horizon, not as a vanity project for an incompetent heir, but as the innovative platform it had always deserved to be. We launched the new version 18 months after the acquisition. The response from the market exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Industry analysts described it as a breakthrough product that established Nexus as a clear leader in enterprise software innovation. I should have been happy. In many ways, I was. But something nagged at me, a feeling I could not entirely shake. I had gotten everything I wanted. I had taken the company that had wronged me. I had destroyed the career of the man who had stolen my work. I had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that my talent and determination could overcome privilege and nepotism. So why did I still feel empty? The answer came to me gradually, over months of reflection. Revenge, I realized, is not an endpoint. It is a process, and like any process, it changes you. The person I had become over the past 3 years, calculated, strategic, focused on victory at all costs, was not the person I had started out as. The woman who had taught herself to code on library computers, who had believed in the power of hard work to overcome obstacles, who had wanted to build things that mattered, that woman had been transformed into something harder, something colder. I had won. But I was not sure I liked who I had become in order to win. Gerald Whitfield retired quietly after the acquisition, taking a modest payout and disappearing from the industry entirely. I heard through former colleagues that he had moved to Florida with his wife, that his health had continued to decline, and that he spent his days golfing and avoiding conversations about his professional legacy. Brandon Whitfield was another matter. After being forced out of the combined company, he attempted to start another venture, some kind of consulting firm that traded on the Whitfield name without any of the substance behind it. The firm failed within 8 months, leaving Brandon with mounting debts and a reputation that had become industry-wide shorthand for incompetence. The last I heard, Brandon was working at a small regional bank in a mid-level position with no supervisory responsibilities. He had been forced to sell the expensive car and the luxury apartment. He had been humbled in exactly the way I had once fantasized about. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something closer to pity, not forgiveness. What Gerald and Brandon had done to me was wrong, and they had earned their consequences. But pity for the wasted potential, for the destroyed relationships, for the legacy of dysfunction that had been their only inheritance. And pity, perhaps, for myself, for the years I had spent consumed by a desire for revenge, years I could have spent building things that mattered without the shadow of resentment darkening everything. The 8th and final phase was letting go. I am writing this now from my office at Nexus, still called Nexus, though the combined company has grown far beyond what either original organization could have imagined. I am the Chief Operating Officer, a position I earned through years of demonstrated results. Victoria remains the CEO, and our partnership has become something I genuinely value. The anger that once drove me has faded. It still flickers occasionally. When I think about that smirk in the conference room, when I remember the humiliation of being told I would support the man who had stolen my work, but it no longer controls me. I have learned things from this experience that I could not have learned any other way. I learned that loyalty is a two-way contract. When you give everything to an organization and it gives nothing in return, you are not betraying anyone by walking away. You are simply recognizing reality. I learned that talent without power is vulnerable. I had believed that doing excellent work would be enough to protect me. It was not. Real security comes from building positions where your value cannot be ignored or stolen. I learned that revenge, when executed well, can be professionally satisfying but personally hollow. The destruction of Gerald and Brandon brought me moments of vindication, but it did not fill the emptiness that their betrayal had created. Only building something positive, relationships, products, a company that reflected my values, could begin to fill that space. And I learned that becoming someone you do not recognize is not victory. It is just another form of loss. I sometimes think about what I would tell my younger self. The woman who sat in that conference room watching someone else claim credit for her work. I would tell her that the path ahead would be harder and longer than she expected. I would tell her that she would succeed beyond her wildest dreams. I would tell her that the cost of that success would be higher than she understood. And I would tell her that it was worth it, not the revenge itself, but the journey, the discovery of her own strength, the building of something genuine, The eventual emergence into a life that was truly her own, no longer defined by what others had done to her. I took everything from the people who took everything from me. But the real victory was not taking, it was becoming. Becoming someone who could not be discarded. Becoming someone who built rather than just destroyed. Becoming someone whose value was undeniable, whose contribution was visible, whose place in the industry was earned through merit and secured through wisdom. Gerald and Brandon Whitfield thought they could use me and discard me. They thought my work was something they could appropriate without consequence. They thought loyalty was a resource to be exploited rather than a relationship to be honored. They were wrong about all of it. And now I sit in an office that was once Gerald's, leading a company that absorbed everything he built, watching the platform I created transform an industry. The project they stole is mine again. The clients they took for granted chose me. The legacy they tried to build on my back collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. Karma is real. Justice exists. And sometimes, when you are smart enough, patient enough, and determined enough, you get to watch as the universe corrects its mistakes and puts things back in their proper order. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I was betrayed by people I trusted, robbed of credit I had earned, and discarded like I meant nothing. And then I rose, quietly, strategically, inevitably. The chairman's son thought he could take my project and leave me with nothing. He was wrong. Now he has nothing. And I have everything. That is not revenge. That is justice.